We come now to motion number 4, relating to the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. I have provisionally selected the following amendments, colleagues, in the following order. K, in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, Mr Ian Blackford. I remind the House that reference may be made in debate to any of the amendments on the paper, including those which I have not selected. The honourable gentleman speaking from the Scottish National Party front bench now has a possibly unrivalled opportunity to demonstrate by comparison with his front bench colleagues just how brief he can be. Mr Stephen Gethins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, here we are with yet another debate and another vote as the clock ticks towards leaving the European Union on the 29th of March. And as the clock ticks towards a no-deal Brexit and a cliff edge that everybody knows would be disastrous, that everybody knows would be damaging. I have to say that from day one, this has been a lesson in gross irresponsibility, and particularly a lesson in gross irresponsibility from this government. So our amendment today is a very simple one and a very straightforward one. And that is to take no deal off the table altogether. Now, in her statement yesterday, the Prime Minister was uncharacteristically clear when she said that we would have a vote to take no deal off the table for the end of March on the 13th of March. And this simply goes that one step forward, further forward to say, why don't we take no deal off the table altogether? Because what we know is through the public statements, and also from what we know in Cabinet, and the ministers in the front bench will be well aware of this, is that even members of Cabinet and officials are warning of the devastation that no deal will bring. Everybody knows it's not a negotiating tactic, it's simply a tactic to hold a fracturing party opposite together. And we have a government in peacetime, that we know is preparing for medicine shortages, that is preparing for food shortages, that we know has discussed martial law and civil unrest. And that's something that is deeply disconcerting to everybody and underlines why no deal must be taken off the table. Now, our amendment today isn't just something that the Scottish National Party have called for, and I'm grateful to colleagues from the Green Party, Plaid Cymru and the Liberal Democrats for backing that, but it's also something that I know colleagues in the Labour Party and members of the party opposite have also called for, including in the last speech by the Right Honourable Member for Meriden as well, is in terms we must take no deal off the table altogether, and that's why this is such a simple motion. But as well as he's, and I'll give way, since I mentioned the lady, I will give way to her.
Just as he mentions the amendment, I should have made clear to colleagues around the House, having been reassured by what I've heard today and the consistency of what ministers said, I won't put my amendment to the House, just so for clarity. Yeah.
I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Member for making that clarification. I do move the amendment in my name and that of my colleagues, and we will be putting ours, because we think that as the clock ticks, we can't wait for another 2 weeks. We've been waiting for another couple of weeks or another few days for months and years now. This House needs to take a bit of responsibility about the situation in which we have been left, and about for which posterity and history will judge us. And let me on that, for the way history will judge us, talk about the human element of this. Now, I don't want to embarrass him, Mr Speaker, but I'm going to say a few kind words about the member of South Leicestershire. Now, a number of years ago, the member of South Leicestershire asked the Prime Minister, 3 years ago in Prime Minister's questions, don't make me vote against my parents' interests. And we back his amendment he's rightly put down about EU citizens. We back him, and we think he's doing a brave thing and a decent thing, and I note remarks that have been made by his former colleagues, such as Lord Duncan of Springbank, about how valuable they thought it was working for him. Now, I hope I haven't damaged his future political prospects too much by saying that. I hope not. But I remark on the decency of what he's trying to do and his own personal situation and the bravery of what he's done today. And what I find incredibly striking, that as we have a government where collective responsibility is breaking down, a Prime Minister who remarks that she doesn't want a cabinet full of yes men because she can't get collective responsibility, where ministers have been able to say whatever they like regardless of what government policy is, that you end up sacking a member of government for agreeing with you. What kind of situation are we in? Mr. Speaker, I have to say this is an extraordinary set of circumstances whereby the Prime Minister fails to sack cabinet members for disagreeing with her publicly and sacks a member who she has agreed with, who the Minister agreed with it, that he's not in his place at the moment, agreed with at the dispatch box, and who the Home Secretary found it extraordinary that he was in agreement with them as well this morning. That's an extraordinary state of affairs. And don't worry, I'm sure the member and I will come back to disagree with us on other times. But I salute what he's done today and the way in which he's conducted himself as well, as a common decency we too rarely see in this Brexit debate. Now, in terms of Project Fear that we get told about, Project Fear is not Project Fear when it's a matter of fact. Now, right now, 1 in 3 businesses is planning to relocate some of their operations, and 1 of 10 have done so. The UK is seen as a bad choice for investment, and I quote the Global Chief Investment Officer at UBS Wealth Management, which is, the consensus amongst those investors is that the UK is uninvestable at this point. That's not good for anybody. Not good for anybody. We also have a decline with our public services. And in terms of EU nationals, I'll quote, a dramatic decline, 87% in applications from EEA nationals for UK registration, according to the Nursing and Midwifery Council. That crucial public service where EU nationals fill gaps in the workplace, providing that crucial public services. So much damage is being done by this threat of a no deal. Our amendment is a simple one. I hope members will back it because it is a very straightforward one and will help take away. And on that point, I'll give way to the honourable member who is trying to get in.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, but he tends to just simply ignore the fact that the British economy is doing well. We have record inward investment, record low unemployment, record manufacturing output, despite all the so-called uncertainty and the doom and gloom that the SNP predict. Don't forget, the predictions last time were so badly wrong, the Bank of England had to very publicly apologise for getting it so wrong.
This is the extraordinary thing that I find, and the honourable member knows I've got huge respect for him. He and I served in the Foreign Affairs Committee together. But he's telling us we can't trust the government's figures. Yeah. Who can we trust anymore if we can't trust his own government? Who can we trust when we're trying to make a judgment? Who can we trust when we're trying to make judgments about the future? We know this is having a real impact, and I'm going to come to some of this shortly. And we're almost 3 years on from the EU referendum. Mr. Speaker, I'm not even entirely sure why we're doing this at the moment. I've just been reading that apparently Poundland is going to be doing burgundy and blue passport covers, and we could all have a choice, and there'll be £1 a go. Now, Mr. Speaker, maybe if the government decides to buy one for everybody in the UK, we can all have our own choice. It'll save us a lot of hassle, and it'll be a lot cheaper than it will be crashing out of the European Union as well. Because let's not lose sight of the grosser responsibility of where we've got to. That we have a minority government that is failing to be a minority government. Other European legislators manage it. The Scottish Government manages it. It's not always easy. It's difficult. The Welsh Government does. But you speak to the other parties. You engage in opposition. You have a government that's trying to run the show as if they have a majority of 100. Mr. Speaker, further information, they do not have a majority of 100. They lost their majority at the last general election. We didn't lose our majority at the last general election. The government did. But let's not lose sight of where we are. It was the charlatans and chancers who backed Vote Leave on a blank piece of paper, did not have the decency, courtesy or democratic accountability, and the Minister is one of them, to put down what vote leave meant. This is why we're in the mess that we are in today. It is a mess entirely of the Minister and his colleagues' own making. And it is one for which they are paying the price, but unfortunately one for which the rest of us are paying the price too. And what's happened? Let's look at the and I've taken a cut from that side, so I'll take an intervention from the Labour benches this time.
Does he agree that that mess includes business confidence falling in the last 4 quarters, 3.7% in the last quarter, and consumer confidence at the lowest level since 2012?
And the member is absolutely right. We've seen business confidence falling. We're seeing investment falling. These are a matter of fact. Now, I'm going to come on to some more figures in a moment, but I'd like to talk about the UK's standing in the world. This is something that was talked about. Democracy and the UK's standing. Democracy. They talk of unelected bureaucrats, where the greatest number of parliamentarians are the unelected ones in the House of Lords. Yeah. That's not democracy, Mr. Speaker. In a parliament, a European Parliament, which is elected, a commission which is accountable to that Parliament, a council made up of the 28 elected governments there as well. It's a damn sight more democratic than this place is. So let's look at what's happened recently. And for all those, and I'll give away one last point that.
He's making a very good point about democratic accountability, and I've been sitting on countless financial services SIs which will take powers and give them to the FCA and to the PRA and to the Treasury, and will not give them to MPs in this House.
And it's been extraordinary. And the Honourable Lady, as usual, makes an excellent point about where this government have tried to take it away, trying to take votes from us, trying to take away our way that we hold them to account, in a way that you just couldn't get away with in the European institutions, whether you like it or not. And I have to say, in terms of that no planning and that vote leaving a blank piece of paper, Donald Tusk, I think, was being restrained when he said that there's a special place in hell for those who backed Brexit without a clue on how to get there. And for all those snowflakes who feigned outrage about his remarks, this is a man who fought the communists because they were under Soviet vassal state at that point, unlike others. This is a man who was arrested for his beliefs, stood up for his beliefs, and yet when he paints out the blindingly obvious, he gets dragged over the coals for it. What outrage! It was faux outrage, and I will give way on that point if he can possibly justify it.
I honestly don't think that Slovenia has anything to do with the discussion of the withdrawal agreement that we're talking about today. The amendment proposed by the SNP, which is what the honourable gentleman should be referring to, talks about this House being determined not to leave the European Union without a withdrawal agreement. Therefore, will he confirm that the SNP will be supporting the government's deal, which will be on the table before the 12th of March?
I haven't even mentioned Slovenia yet, but the honourable member knows the reference I'm making. He's clearly, because I know he's a decent member, and I know he's served his country well in the diplomatic service, and I know he will have been embarrassed by the recent remarks in the Foreign Secretary. And I want to talk about. I'm a front-bench speaker, and I want to talk about what's happened in terms of the UK standing in the world, of which we are still a part for the time being. That there are those who are quite content to compare the EU to the USSR and can't handle these remarks from Donald Tusk. And this goes to the point, that just the point when we need friends and influence around the world, as the honourable member well knows, and I know how hard he works on these things, that we are losing them. And let's look at some of the reactions to that. Carl Bildt, the former Swedish Prime Minister, said, "Britain used to be a nation providing leadership to the world. Now it can't even provide leadership to itself." Latvia's ambassador to London: "Soviets killed, deported, exiled and imprisoned hundreds of thousands of Latvians inhabitants after the legal occupation in 1940 and ruined the lives of 3 generations, whilst the EU has brought prosperity, equality, growth and respect." Please reflect on that. Please reflect on what our closest friends and allies are telling us. And in terms of Slovenia, asked to respond to Hunt's remarks, the Commission's chief spokesman on the Soviet Union said, "I would say respectfully that we would all benefit, and in particular foreign affairs ministers, from opening a history book from time to time." But the Foreign Secretary didn't listen, and he doubled down when he went to Slovenia, as the members referenced, and referred to them as a Soviet vassal state, to which the former Speaker of the Slovenian Parliament, said, "The British Foreign Minister comes to Slovenia asking us for a favour, while arrogantly insulting us." And at a time of crisis, and this is the point, the greatest crisis that the UK has faced since the Second World War, we are led by political pygmies who do not understand the history of those countries who are closest to us, never mind the history of the nations of these islands. They have turned the UK into the political basket case of Europe. There is utter astonishment and bewilderment in Brussels and elsewhere at the decline of the UK. But it's not only there. There's astonishment, I find, in Scotland at what's going on down here, even by those who, unlike me, back the Union here. Now, last night, and the member for BrExit was right to raise her point of order last night, and I listened to it carefully. And she was right, and I'm glad that she got the no-deal papers released due to her work, and I thank her for it. It was pretty flimsy, it has to be said. I thought it was quite flimsy, a very small document. The Scottish Government document, there's much more to it there. And their analysis, which the Scottish Government was happy to have published a long time ago without having to be forced to, a long time ago, has shown that any form of Brexit will be damaging to Scotland's economy. The deal will be damaging to Scotland's economy, and that's why we cannot vote for it. But a no-deal Brexit could result in a recession worse than 2008, causing Scotland's GDP to fall back to 7% and lead to unemployment rising by around 100,000 in Scotland alone. And I'll give way, because I referenced the Honourable Lady.
I think that the point that everybody in this House needs, if I may say, to understand is that on Privy Council terms, I saw the entirety of the most recent documents that members of this government's cabinet and the important subcommittee had seen. I saw a large number of those documents, and notwithstanding the contents of those documents that make it clear, in the words of the business secretary, not the Brexit secretary, he was very keen for me to set the record straight on this, Mr. Speaker, because last night I said that he had described no deal as ruinous. I would have liked him to have adopted the view of the business secretary, who does describe it as ruinous. But notwithstanding the clear information available to the most senior members of this government, they refuse to take no deal off the table. If I may say gently to the honourable gentleman, I think he might agree, that is the disgrace. They know what a no deal would do to this country, and they refuse point blank to take it off the table.
As usual, the Honourable Lady makes a powerful and valid point, and might I say, because it's the first time I've been able to say, it's nice to hear her speaking so much more closely to me nowadays as well to make these points. And I might regret it, she's right. But she makes a very powerful point, as she often does. And this is why our amendment today, and I hope she'll support it, is a very simple one, that we take no deal off the table. Because the Cabinet knows how damaging it is. Business knows how damaging it is. These papers are there, they've been seen, as the Honourable Lady is correct to point out. And on top of that, in terms of the Scottish Government analysis, we also know the EU structural funds, worth €941 million to Scotland across the EU budget period, and we don't know what happens next. Almost €1 billion, and we don't know. University of Scotland have 4,500 EU national staff facing uncertainty. It's something that I see day and daily in my constituency work. And a letter from 150 universities saying leaving the EU without a deal is one of the biggest threats to that our universities have ever faced. Now, the University of St Andrews that signed that letter has been around for over 600 years. They have a bit of context. They know a thing or two. And you know what stings? Scotland never voted for this. But we were the first to suggest an extension as common sense. The Scottish Government was the first to propose a compromise that the UK Government didn't really have the decency to respond to. And here we are proposing to work with the Government to reach out to take no deal off the table as well. We didn't vote for this, but we have to engage with it, and we have engaged with it. And I also pay tribute to our friends and colleagues from different parties who have worked with us on that as well, because that's the right thing to do with where we are. And I look at Scottish food and drink, who think that the Scottish food and drink industry think that we will lose £2 billion loss of sales annually. This doesn't affect the hedge fund managers. It doesn't manage those who have pushed money offshore. It affects those who are the poorest and most vulnerable. It affects small businesses and unemployment in some of the areas of the United Kingdom who can least afford it. Now, I also hear about the EU as a political union. Why would you want to be a member of the UK and the EU? Well, you know what? The EU listens to you. You're a partnership of equals in the EU. It cannot force you to do things. You have a court of justice. You have a parliament. You have a council of ministers. All these things that you have, and the UK has none of them. The EU is a club for independent, growing, thriving member states. There's no place for independence within the United Kingdom. There's no place for a partnership of equals within the United Kingdom. So finally, our motion is a cross-party motion. Rules out no deal altogether. It is simple and it is straightforward. We want to take things out of the hands of the Prime Minister, yes we do, but we also want her to commit to this, because it's become very difficult, I'm sorry to say, Mr Speaker, to trust anything that the Prime Minister says increasingly, with her twists and turns. And I'm sorry to say that. 4 weeks away, this seems to be a responsible course of action. So many bits of legislation still to be passed. And finally, on the point, and I've raised many points, and I'll address the honourable member. Just think what we've put £4.2 billion into no-deal preparation. Just think what we could have done with the £4.2 billion at a time of continued Westminster austerity, at a time when our public services are crying out for it, at a time we should be tackling climate change, poverty, all these other challenges. Taking no deal and continuing to have no deal is irresponsible, it's irrational, but if I can appeal to some of the Tories, it's also very, very expensive. And I hope that anybody here will join us in backing our cross-party motion today. Thank you.
Order a 5-minute limit.